Deep beneath the Antarctic ice, a hidden empire pulses with life. Base 211 is no mere outpost. It is a vast, self-sustaining subterranean city carved from living rock by armies of slave laborers and brilliant engineers. Geothermal vents roar far below, powering endless corridors of light, laboratories that never sleep, and hangars large enough to swallow entire fleets of aircraft. The air is warm, filtered, scented with ozone and machine oil. The hum of advanced generators never ceases. In the command center, Adolf Hitler himself, gaunt but alive, eyes burning with the same messianic fire, sits at a long obsidian table. Around him are the last true believers, Himmler's chosen SS scientists, von Braun's rocket men who never surrendered, and a new generation of Aryan technicians born in the polar dark. They wear crisp black uniforms, still bearing the runes and lightning bolts. They speak in hushed, reverent tones of the coming Fourth Reich. In the great hangars, the flying saucers rest on their cradles. Sleek, silver discs, reverse-engineered from captured alien technology or born from the genius of Die Glocke. Their mercury vortex engines glow with an eerie blue light. Pilots in pressure suits climb aboard, ready to rise through hidden shafts in the ice and strike anywhere on Earth. In the weapons laboratories, death rays and weather control devices hum with power. In the biological wings, geneticists continue the work of perfecting the master race. In the vaults, mountains of looted gold, priceless art, and ancient occult artifacts fund an empire that the Allies believed they had destroyed. Every day, the base operates with terrifying efficiency. U-boats surface through polynesias in the ice to deliver fresh personnel and rare earth minerals. Saucers launch silently into the polar night on missions of reconnaissance and intimidation. The men and women inside believe they are the last pure flame of the Reich, untouched, unbowed, waiting for the day the world above tears itself apart so they can emerge and claim their destiny. This is the glory the legend promises, not defeat, but transcendence, not ruin, but a secret rebirth more powerful than anything the surface world could imagine. And yet, if the Nazis had achieved this technological and ideological triumph while the rest of the world celebrated victory, what would that say about us? What does it mean that so many of us still find this vision not horrifying but strangely comforting? As we examine the record of the Third Reich's most peculiar undertakings, few stories have captured the public imagination with quite the same stubborn persistence as the legend of a secret Nazi base buried beneath the Antarctic ice. Picture it, vast caverns carved into the eternal darkness. Hangars echoing with the hum of impossible machines. Flying saucers rising through cracks in the ice shelf. And somewhere in the frozen heart of it all, Adolf Hitler and his inner circle living on in defiant exile, while the world above believes the war is over. For more than 80 years, this vision has refused to die. It appears in books, documentaries, internet forums, and late-night conversations. It is the ultimate what if, not merely survival, but technological transcendence at the bottom of the world. Let us be completely honest about the appeal. In an age of uncertainty, disillusionment, and fractured trust. The idea that powerful forces are still operating in secret offers a seductive sense of hidden order. The Antarctic base myth promises agency where we so often feel powerless. It offers justice where we see none. It offers technological salvation in a world that frequently feels ordinary, bureaucratic, and disappointing. It flatters our desire to believe that the story is bigger, darker, and more dramatic than the official record allows. This is not a fringe curiosity. It is a mirror to our own era of conspiracy thinking, a phenomenon that has only grown stronger in the decades since 1945. The people who first spread these stories are just as important to understand as any Nazi official. They were not generals or scientists in the regime. They were journalists, authors, and ideologues working in the chaotic post-war years. Men responding to trauma, commercial opportunity, and the deep human need for narrative closure. Their motives, their contexts, and their methods reveal how legends are manufactured and why they endure long after the facts have been settled. Understanding them is essential if we are to see the pattern clearly. Over the next hour, we will do something that is rarely done with this topic. We will begin with the real history, the modest 1938-39 German Antarctic Expedition, and what it actually achieved on the ice. We will then meet the specific individuals who transformed that limited operation into one of the most elaborate myths of the 20th century. Only after we have walked the full historical ground will we step into the most seductive version of the legend, a fully operational secret base, complete with advanced craft and surviving leadership. And throughout, we will notice a striking parallel, that our hunger for conspiracy is often a reflection of the very Nazi hunger for magical solutions that ignored situational reality. Both create the same dangerous blind spot, a refusal to accept what the evidence actually shows. I'm Dr. Adrian Lang. Welcome to Reich of Folly. If this careful opening exploration of the legend and its stakes is proving valuable so far, I'd be grateful for a simple like. It helps more people discover history told with care and respect, rather than hype. Thank you. Let us begin. As we examine the record, the story begins not with flying saucers or underground cities, but with a converted catapult ship named the MS Schwabenland, and a 49-year-old captain named Alfred Ritscher. Ritscher was no ordinary naval officer. Born in 1879 in a small town in what is now Poland, he had already survived one of the most harrowing polar disasters of the early 20th century. In 1912, as part of a German Arctic expedition to Spitsbergen, his ship was crushed by ice. Ritscher led a desperate overland trek across the frozen wilderness, walking alone for days after the rest of the party became separated, surviving on sheer will and a handful of supplies. That experience left him with a lifelong fascination with polar extremes, and a personal tolerance for isolation and hardship that would later make him the perfect choice for Goering's Antarctic venture. Yet it also revealed the same pattern we see throughout the Nazi era. A man whose personal survival story fed into a larger ideology of triumph over impossible odds, a belief that human will could conquer geography itself. In July 1938, Hermann Goering, the man in charge of Germany's four-year plan for economic self-sufficiency, authorized a lightning expedition to the Antarctic. While the official purposes were to secure whaling grounds and conduct scientific research, the extreme haste was driven by the looming prospect of war. The expedition had to be completed before conflict broke out and made such a voyage impossible. Even the economic rationale was optimistic. Although whale oil was genuinely important to Germany's peacetime economy, once war started, any attempt to extract and ship it from Antarctica back to Germany would have been extremely vulnerable to Allied naval power. The Nazis appear to have assumed the war would be short, the classic blitzkrieg mindset, which made long supply lines seem less problematic at the time. Ritscher accepted the command with the quiet professionalism of a man who had already stared death in the face once and lived to tell about it. His personal history of Arctic survival reinforced the regime's narrative of Aryan resilience, even as it masked the deeper hubris that would doom any attempt at permanence. The choice of the name Schwabenland for both the ship and the claimed territory was deliberate and symbolic. The ship had already carried that name as a Lufthansa catapult vessel used for transatlantic airmail. But the decision to name the Antarctic territory Neuschwabenland, New Swabia, was a conscious act of ideological expansion. Swabia was a historic heartland of German identity and pride, associated with medieval heritage, skilled craftsmanship, and deep regional loyalty. By giving a vast slice of Antarctica the same name, the regime was performing a ritual of ownership, symbolically extending the German homeland to the bottom of the world. This was classic Nazi theatricality. Grand, symbolic gestures in place of practical capability. They could name ice shelves after German regions and drop metal swastika flags from aeroplanes, but they had neither the means nor the intention to actually settle or develop the territory. What followed was a remarkable feat of organization under extreme time pressure. In just 6 months, Ritscher assembled a crew of 82 men, equipped the Schwabenland with 2 Dornier Wahl seaplanes named Boreas and Passat, and sailed from Hamburg on December 17, 1938. The 2 seaplanes were given deliberately symbolic names. Boreas was the Greek god of the north wind, evoking raw power and the cold, fierce conditions the expedition would face. Passat is the German word for trade wind, representing steady, reliable progress. Together, the names suggested the ideal combination of strength and dependability the Nazis hoped to project onto their Antarctic venture. Another example of the regime's fondness for mythological and natural symbolism, even in its most practical equipment. The ship reached the Antarctic coast on January 19, 1939, anchoring in the pack ice off the Princess Martha coast. Over the next weeks, 15 photogrammetric flights were launched from the ship's catapult. They covered approximately 600,000 square kilometers, took more than 16,000 aerial photographs, and produced the first detailed maps of the region between roughly 10 degrees west and 15 degrees east longitude. At the turning points of the flight polygons, 1.2-meter-long aluminium arrows with 30-centimeter steel cones and 3 upper stabilizer wings embossed with swastikas were dropped in an attempt to establish German claims to ownership. Although Germany never formally raised any such claim. Due to flight complications, these markers were only dropped once, not repeatedly as is sometimes claimed in later accounts. Brief landings were also made on the ice shelf for rock samples, geomagnetic measurements, and meteorological observations using radiosondes that ascended into the polar atmosphere. The expedition returned to Germany in April 1939, having spent less than 2 months actually working on the ice. What the sources actually show is a limited but genuine scientific and economic mission. The aerial photography and meteorological data gathered were of real value. Some of the maps and images later assisted international Antarctic research in the 1950s and beyond. There was no permanent base. There were no overwintering personnel. There were no U-boats. There was no infrastructure of any kind. The entire operation was conducted with the technology and resources available in 1938 to 39, a prestige project executed with typical Nazi haste and grandiosity. It achieved exactly what its limited means allowed: photographs, names on a map, and a claim that existed only on paper and in propaganda newsreels. This is where ideology began to override evidence. The regime could photograph and name vast tracts of Antarctica, but it could never hold them. The same pattern of seeking grand, almost magical solutions while ignoring practical limits would later define the mythmakers who came after. Let us pause here and consider the human cost. The men on the Schwabenland endured brutal conditions. Freezing temperatures, isolation, the constant threat of being trapped in the pack ice. For a mission that ultimately delivered little strategic value. Their suffering, like that of so many others in the Nazi era, was real, even if the grand claims were not. Now that we have seen what actually happened, let us turn to how that modest expedition became the foundation of one of the most persistent legends of the 20th century. What is crucial to understand, and what most people today do not realize, is that the story we think we know in 2026 is not the story that existed in 1947. The modern composite myth, Nazi flying saucers, anti-gravity technology, Die Glocke, underground bases with advanced propulsion, is a layered fabrication that grew over decades. Each generation of authors added new elements to serve their own psychological and commercial needs. Let us trace exactly how this happened, because seeing the evolution reveals something profound about how fabrications grow and why they persist. In 1947, Hungarian journalist Ladislas Szabo published the book Je sais que Hitler est vivant. I know Hitler is alive. His claim focused primarily on Adolf Hitler escaping Berlin and being taken to a secret base in Antarctica aboard the German U-boats U-530 and U-977, which surrendered in Argentina that summer. While Szabo mentioned that the submarines carried important cargo and senior Nazis, the detailed stories about Nazi gold, looted art, and hidden treasure were largely added later by other writers in the late 1940s and 1950s, and greatly expanded in the 1970s. Szabo's book was the seed, but the full treasure narrative came afterwards. Argentina became central to these stories for two powerful reasons. First, both U-boats actually surrendered in the Argentine port of Mar del Plata, a documented fact that gave the legends a real geographic anchor. Second, Argentina had a large German-speaking diaspora, and under President Juan Perón was sympathetic to the Axis cause and actively helped many Nazis escape Europe. This combination of real events and political climate made Argentina the perfect setting for the myths to grow. The first major expansion came in the mid-1970s. This is when Willibald Mattern and Ernst Zündel, writing under the pseudonyms Christoph Friedrich and Mattern Friedrich, published their books UFOs Unbekanntes Flugobjekt, 1974, and UFOs, Nazi secret weapon, 1975. They took Szabo's basic Antarctic base story and deliberately grafted it onto the already established UFO craze that had been running since 1947. By the 1970s, flying saucers were a massive cultural phenomenon. Mattern and Zündel saw a commercial opportunity. By claiming the 1947 UFO wave was actually Nazi technology launched from the Antarctic base, they could tap into an existing, highly engaged audience. Psychologically, this served Zündel's ideological goals as a neo-Nazi propagandist. It portrayed the defeated Reich as technologically superior and still secretly powerful. Commercially, it allowed him to sell books through his samizdat publishing network to both far-right circles and the much larger UFO enthusiast community. This was the moment the flying saucer element was added. It was not part of Szabo's original story. It was a later fabrication designed to ride the wave of popular interest in UFOs. The story grew again in the 2000s when Joseph P. Farrell published Reich of the Black Sun, 2004, the SS Brotherhood of the Bell, 2006, and Nazi International, 2009. Farrell took the existing Antarctic base plus Nazi UFO narrative and layered on a much more elaborate anti-gravity and exotic physics story, most famously promoting Die Glocke, the bell, a supposed Nazi device involving mercury-like compounds and anti-gravity effects. Importantly, Die Glocke was not part of the 1970s story. It was a later addition. Farrell, with a background in theology and philosophy, approached the material from a different psychological angle than Zündel. He framed it as suppressed history and forbidden science, appealing to audiences interested in ancient mysteries, alternative physics, and New Age ideas, rather than overt neo-Nazism. Commercially, this was highly effective. Farrell's books reached a much broader mainstream conspiracy audience that would never have touched Zündel's openly far-right material. Psychologically, Farrell's work satisfied the same human need for hidden explanations and technological transcendence, but wrapped it in a more palatable, quasi-academic package. What we see here is a classic example of how fabrications grow over time. Each author took the existing story, added new elements that served their own psychological needs and commercial interests, and passed it on. Szabo needed drama in 1947. Mattern and Zündel needed to reach the UFO audience in the 1970s. Farrell needed to reach the alternative history audience in the 2000s. None of them started with the full modern story. They built it incrementally, layer by layer, because that is how myths evolve when they are useful to the people telling them. The context for all of these originators was the same: a world still reeling from the horror of the Holocaust and the astonishing speed of Germany's defeat. Many people struggled to accept that such monumental evil could end so suddenly and so ordinarily. Others saw commercial opportunity in a public hungry for hidden explanations. Still others had explicit political agendas. These mythmakers were not Nazi officials. They were journalists, authors, and activists operating in the free press of the post-war West. Their stories reveal as much about human psychology and the economics of belief as they do about the Third Reich itself. The myths spread because they met real emotional and cultural needs: the desire for narrative closure, the comfort of secret power, the thrill of being in the know against official lies, and the psychological relief of believing that the story was bigger than the mundane facts allowed. In doing so, they created a lasting blind spot By shifting attention onto cool Nazi tech and secret bases, these legends can inadvertently distract from the actual victims of the regime. The millions murdered in the camps, the families destroyed, the societies shattered. The mythmakers replaced the mundane mechanics of Nazi failure with something far more cinematic and comforting. Our continued appetite for these stories reveals the same blind spot the Nazis themselves suffered from. The refusal to accept situational reality when a more magical narrative is available. One of the most persistent threads in the early myth was the claim that two German U-boats, U-530 and U-977, had delivered Hitler or high-ranking officials to the Antarctic base before surrendering in Argentina in the summer of 1945. The real reasons for their late surrender are far more mundane and human. Both submarines had been on extended patrols in the South Atlantic for months, low on fuel, with crews suffering from exhaustion, vitamin deficiencies, and the psychological strain of prolonged submerged operations in cramped, foul air conditions. The captains chose Argentina, a neutral country with a large German immigrant population and some sympathy for the Axis, as the least dangerous port of surrender, rather than risk capture by Allied forces or scuttling at sea. There was no secret mission to Antarctica. The crews were simply trying to survive the final weeks of a lost war. Yet the myth seized on these late arrivals as proof of something more dramatic, ignoring the documented logs, fuel shortages, and crew testimonies that tell a story of ordinary desperation rather than extraordinary escape. This brings us to another layer of the human frailty that would have doomed any Antarctic venture: the widespread use of methamphetamine, known as Pervitin, throughout the German military. By 1939, Pervitin was standard issue for pilots, tank crews, and U-boat sailors to maintain alertness during long missions. The drug produced short-term euphoria, heightened focus, and endurance, but at a terrible cost. Chronic use led to paranoia, psychosis, severe mood swings, cognitive decline, physical deterioration, and profound addiction. Soldiers and submariners returned from missions exhibiting symptoms indistinguishable from schizophrenia, hallucinations, violent outbursts, and complete emotional collapse. In the isolation of an Antarctic base, with no resupply, no medical support, and the added stresses of extreme cold, darkness, and confinement, these psychological issues would have been catastrophic. Crews already prone to paranoia from the drug would have turned on each other within weeks. Decision-making would have deteriorated into delusion. The same magical solution that the regime relied upon to extend human limits would have accelerated breakdown in the polar environment. This is not speculation divorced from evidence. It is the documented reality of Nazi pharmacology meeting the unforgiving physics of Antarctica. Now that we've seen what the historical record actually contains, let me invite you to pause and reflect with me. If you were to think critically about this chapter of the war, how might you view the history differently? I'd genuinely like to know your thoughts in the comments. Now we reach the section that for many viewers is the reason they clicked. Let us be completely honest about the appeal of the grandest version of this legend. The fully operational secret base. Vast underground caverns lit by geothermal power. Hangars filled with disc-shaped craft that defy known physics. Adolf Hitler and his closest followers living in a self-sustaining Fourth Reich at the bottom of the world satisfies multiple deep human needs at once. It restores agency to the defeated. It offers technological transcendence. It provides a hidden explanation for why the world feels chaotic and unjust. It flatters our desire to believe that somewhere, hidden from justice, the Nazis achieved what they could not in Europe. The people who first crafted these stories understood those needs instinctively. Szabo, Mattern, Zündel, writing as Friedrich, and later Farrell, were responding to the same post-war trauma, commercial incentives, and cognitive biases, including proportionality bias, the belief that such monumental evil must have an equally monumental hidden explanation, and agency detection gone awry, that still drive conspiracy thinking today. We create and cling to these legends because facing the mundane truth that evil can be both monstrous and bureaucratically incompetent is harder than believing in a hidden master plan. Here we encounter a striking parallel. Our hunger for conspiracy is often a reflection of the very Nazi hunger for magical solutions that ignored situational reality. The Third Reich repeatedly sought Wunderwaffen, polar empires, and ideological destiny that reality could never deliver. In the same way, many of us today prefer elaborate hidden narratives over the simpler, evidence-based explanation that the Nazis were defeated by ordinary logistics, economics, and human limitation. Both impulses create the same dangerous blind spot, a refusal to accept what the record actually shows. Evidence-informed speculation suggests we now step into the most seductive version of the myth. Imagine a fully realized Antarctic redoubt. Excavated caverns housing factories, laboratories, and living quarters for hundreds. Flying saucers developed in polar secrecy, capable of global range and impossible maneuvers. Hitler, Bormann, and key scientists continuing the ideological project in exile, while the world above believes the war is over. In one layered scenario, saucer technology achieves a breakthrough in 1943 to 44, shifting the air war in Europe's favor and forcing the Allies into a negotiated peace that leaves the Nazi regime intact in some form. In another, Hitler and senior leadership survive in polar exile until the mid-1950s, becoming a symbolic rallying point for neo-Nazis worldwide and altering the moral clarity of the post-war settlement for generations. In a third, the base becomes a functional Fourth Reich outpost with advanced research in rocketry, nuclear technology, and exotic propulsion continuing undetected for decades, eventually leaking technology into the civilian world in the form of the 1947 UFO wave. In a fourth, the base serves as a refuge for stolen art, gold, and scientific documents, allowing a shadow economy to fuel post-war neo-Nazi networks across South America and Europe. In a fifth, the psychological impact on the Allies is profound. A sense that the war was never truly won, breeding paranoia and Cold War-era secrecy that shapes intelligence agencies for decades. In a sixth, the myth itself becomes self-fulfilling, as post-war authors and far-right groups use the story to recruit and radicalize new generations, creating a cultural legacy that persists into the 21st century. We then immediately apply rigorous counterbalance to each. The engineering challenges of 1939 to 45 were insurmountable. No heavy excavation equipment capable of polar conditions. No reliable geothermal infrastructure. 8 months of polar night. Inevitable crew attrition from cold, disease, and isolation. The economic impossibility, as historians such as Adam Tooze have demonstrated, is even more decisive. The Reich was already cannibalizing its own economy and manpower. Diverting resources to an Antarctic project would have accelerated collapse, not prevented it. Military detection was near certain. Allied naval and air dominance made any sustained supply line suicidal. The psychological and moral dimension is equally damning. The same groupthink and authoritarian personality traits that enabled the European catastrophe would have produced the same internal failures in polar isolation. And the long-term global ripples are negligible. Even if such a base had existed, it changes nothing about the 1945 surrender, the Nuremberg trials, or the moral accounting the world rightly demanded. Now let us step back from the cinematic version and ask a more modest, more plausible question. What if the Germans had simply attempted the smallest possible permanent presence? A modest overwintering station or supply depot of the kind the real expedition almost had the capability to attempt. Branching scenarios include a pre-war station established in early 1939 with a dozen men and basic supplies. Wartime resupply attempts via U-boat that never arrive. Or a small post-war survival enclave that slowly starves. Each produces short-term outcomes that sound plausible on paper. A handful of men enduring the winter. Limited scientific work continuing. Perhaps even a symbolic radio beacon broadcasting propaganda. Yet each is immediately balanced against the same crushing constraints. Distance of more than 10,000 kilometers. Pack ice that could trap supply ships for months. Fuel and food requirements that would have starved other fronts. And the collapsing European war effort that made any polar distraction strategically suicidal. Even these limited efforts would have represented a catastrophic misallocation of resources with zero strategic return. And a human cost measured in unnecessary suffering for the men involved. With those evidence-informed possibilities still in mind, let me ask you directly, If a permanent Nazi base had been established in Antarctica, whether the grand underground fortress of legend or a smaller practical settlement, what do you think a reasonable outcome for the war, or for the wider world, might have been? We have now walked the full circle. The Third Reich could photograph and name vast tracts of Antarctica, but it could never hold them. That single fact exposes the core pattern of Nazi folly: hubris dressed as destiny, ideology that refused to acknowledge physical or economic reality. The enduring myth of the secret base reveals something equally important about us, and about the specific individuals who built the legend in the first place. Ladislas Szabo, Willibald Mattern, Ernst Zündel, writing under the pseudonyms Christoph Friedrich and Mattern Friedrich, and Joseph P. Farrell were not Nazi officials. Yet their stories have shaped public understanding of the Third Reich as much as any official document. Our hunger for conspiracy is a reflection of the very Nazi hunger for magical solutions that created a blind spot for truth and situational reality. Understanding why they, and we, prefer these legends is essential if we are to avoid repeating the folly of choosing comforting stories over uncomfortable evidence. If this hour has given you new tools with which to think about history, about folly, and about the seductive power of extraordinary claims in times of crisis, I'd be truly grateful if you would like the video, subscribe for more rigorously grounded explorations in this series, and leave a comment telling us which other Reich folly we should examine next. Thank you for spending this time with me. I'm Dr. Adrian Lang. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next episode of Reich of Folly.